Mrs. Caldwell, we have read the newspaper article. What you did sheltering those men was very admirable.
The chairman did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He set his pen down with a small, deliberate click, folded his hands on the long table in front of him, and looked down at the 71-year-old black grandmother standing alone in the center aisle of the packed courthouse. The way a man looks at an appointment he is already late for.
This is a budget hearing on the macro-fiscal position of this county. It is not the place for sentimental personal stories, and it is not a charity window. Your name is not on the list of registered speakers. We simply do not have the time.
Eunice Caldwell didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her spine straight, clutching her dead husband's battered black union ledger against her chest. The chairman gave a thin, patient smile. The kind powerful men use to make reasonable people feel unreasonable.
I am going to have to ask you to step away from the floor,
he said, with the bored authority of a man who had ended 100 meetings exactly this way.
before I am obliged to call security. I am sure a woman of your years has somewhere warmer to be.
He thought she was just an invisible, powerless old woman. He expected her to gather up her notebook and shrink away in embarrassment, the way the poor and the unregistered always had in that room. But the arrogant chairman had no idea that this forgotten grandmother had just single-handedly saved 6 stranded truckers from a deadly ice storm. And he definitely didn't know that the worn ledger in her hands contained 40 years of the county's dirtiest secrets. She was about to tear his entire corrupt system to the ground. Let's get into it. Now, I need you to hold that image in your mind. A 71-year-old woman, alone, in the center aisle of a packed courtroom, with the most powerful man in the county, calmly, politely telling her she does not belong there. No shouting, no slurs. Just that cold, bureaucratic certainty that some people matter and some people do not. Because in about 20 minutes, that man is going to wish he had never picked up his pen. But to understand why, to really understand what she carried into that room and what it cost him, we have to go back. We have to go back to before that morning. We have to go back to the storm. And before even that, you need to know exactly who Eunice Caldwell was, and why every single person in that valley should have known better than to underestimate her. So let's rewind. Hollow Creek, West Virginia, a coal town wedged into a narrow Appalachian valley, about 2 hours from anywhere that mattered, the kind of place that used to mean something 60 years ago. Hollow Creek was a company town in the best and the worst sense of that word. The mine ran 3 shifts. The tipple worked around the clock. There were 2 churches, a school, a union hall, a company store, a movie house, and a main street where, on a Saturday, you could barely walk for the crowd. Men came up out of the ground, black with coal dust, and proud of it. You could raise a family in Hollow Creek. You could believe in it. And then, on a bit one, the seams played out. The company found cheaper coal in cheaper places. The mine cut to 2 shifts, then 1, then none. The tipple went silent. The company store closed. The movie house became a feed store. And then it became nothing at all. The young people left first, the way young people always do. And then the not-so-young followed them. And the town that had once been too crowded to walk through emptied out until half the houses on every street stood dark and sagging and full of nothing but mice and memory. By the winter this story takes place, Hollow Creek had lost almost two-thirds of the people who had once lived there. The school had consolidated 40 miles away. The Union Hall was boarded up, and the clinic, the little county clinic that had stitched up 2 generations of miners and delivered half the babies in the valley, had closed 2 winters back. When the county commission voted bill in a meeting, almost nobody attended. To cut its funding, the nearest emergency room was now 50 miles out, over the ridge, on a road that froze solid 4 months out of the year, and at the end of a dirt lane called Carver Road. In the same narrow 2-story house where she had lived for 46 years, lived Eunice Caldwell, 71 years old, a retired hospice and county hospital nurse. Avidov, a black woman in a hollow that had never, not once in its whole history, made it easy to be one. Now, I need you to really sit with who this woman was, because the rest of this story does not land unless you do. Eunice came up to Hollow Creek as a girl in the 1960s, when her father followed the mine work north out of Alabama. She was one of maybe a dozen black families in the whole valley. And she learned early and she learned hard what that meant. She rode in the back of the bus to a school 2 counties over, because the closer school would not take the colored children until she was nearly grown. She watched her father do the same dangerous work as the white miners, for less of the pay and none of the credit. She learned to keep her face still and her spine straight and her words careful, because she understood the way every black child in that valley understood that the world had already made up its mind about her before she had said a single word, and that the only thing she controlled was whether she let it make her small. She decided, somewhere around the age of 10, that she would not be made small, and she never was. Not for one single day of her life. Remember that it matters for what comes later. She trained as a nurse, one of the first black nurses the county hospital ever hired, and they only hired her because the war had stripped out half the staff and they were desperate. She spent 30 years on those wards. She held the hands of dying miners whose lungs had filled up with the same coal that built the town. She delivered babies in the back of pickup trucks during floods. She sat up all night with families who had nobody else, white and black, both, because Eunice Caldwell did not have a segregated heart, even in a valley that had a segregated everything else. And for 10 of those 30 years, she did something that made her quietly, permanently feared by the people who ran that county. She served as the union steward for the hospital workers. She learned the rules. She learned the law. She learned exactly how the people in charge cut corners on the poor, and the black, and the old, and she learned how to make them stop, not by yelling, never by yelling, but by knowing the regulation better than they did, by writing it all down, by standing up in a meeting with a folder full of dates and facts and a voice so calm and so certain that the men across the table would shift in their chairs and find a way to give the people what they were owed, just to make her sit back down. The county commissioners knew Eunice Caldwell's name. The hospital board knew it. And not one of them was sorry to see her retire. The chairman, who would one day try to dismiss her from that courtroom, he was new. He had come in after she retired. He did not know her. And that, as it turns out, was the most expensive mistake of his entire career. Now let me tell you about Eunice's situation the winter this story takes place. because it matters. And because it is the same quiet shame that this country lets fall on so many of the people who gave the most. Her husband, Samuel, had been a coal miner and a union man, a big, quiet, steady man. She married in 1979. In the African Methodist Church that had since closed its doors, Samuel had black lung. Everybody in that valley who worked the deep seams got it eventually. It was the bill the mountain always came to collect. He fought it for 15 years. And he lost the fight 8 winters ago. In the county hospital, where Eunice had spent her whole career, with Eunice holding his hand the way she had held 1,000 other hands. The company that owned the mine had been bought and sold 3 times by then. The pension Samuel was promised had been, in their word for it, restructured, down to almost nothing. His black lung benefits, which by federal law he was owed, had been fought and delayed and denied by company lawyers until he was nearly gone. And the back pay only came through 6 weeks after they put him in the ground. Eunice lived now on her own small pension, and her Social Security, a little over $1,200 a month. All told, that was everything. That was the whole of it. The roof over the back bedroom had been leaking since the spring before. She had a galvanized washtub up in the attic to catch it. And she climbed those pull-down stairs at 71 years old to empty it every time it rained. The furnace had given out in October. The repair would have cost more than 2 months of everything she had. So she heated the whole house with Samuel's old cast-iron wood stove and the oak he had split and stacked under a tarp. The last autumn, he was strong enough to swing a maul. She rationed that wood like it was gold. Because in a way, it was. It was the last work of her husband's hands. And when it was gone, it was gone. She taped plastic over the drafty windows, and she pressed the peeling tape back down 100 times a winter. She owed $3,100 to a collections agency for an ambulance ride she had taken the winter before, when she slipped on her own iced-over steps and cracked 2 ribs and could not get up. An ambulance that had to come 50 miles. Because the county had closed the clinic that used to sit 4 blocks from her house. The bill came 3 weeks later, and she put it in a drawer in the kitchen. Because every time she looked at it, her chest went tight. And not from the ribs. That clinic, the one the chairman would dismiss as a sentimental personal story, not worth the time of a budget hearing. That is the clinic she would have needed that night, when she lay on her own frozen steps with 2 broken ribs, alone, and no one for 50 miles to help her. Hold that thought too. But here is the thing you have to understand about Eunice Caldwell. The thing that makes the rest of this story what it is. She never once asked the town for a single thing. Not one. It was not pride. Exactly. And it sure was not that she did not know how. Lord knows she had spent 10 years as a steward, making the system cough up what it owed other people. It was something deeper than that. Eunice believed, all the way down to the foundation of who she was. 2 things at the same time that most people cannot hold together. She believed that you make do with what you have, and you keep your dignity while you do it. And she believed that no matter how little you have, you are still required, by God and by your own conscience, to be the one who shows up for your neighbor. That was her code. That was her religion. After the church closed, and there was no building left to hold it, She drove the Pruitt children, 3 little white kids, whose mama worked a double at the dollar store in the next town over, to and from the bus stop every morning and every afternoon, on roads that scared her, in a beat-up old truck, held together with prayer. And she never took a dime for it. She left covered plates of food on the porches of folks she knew were going through it. The Hatfield boy, who had come home from the war wrong in his mind. Old Doris, who had buried her last son in the fall. And she never knocked and never waited to be thanked. Just set the plate down and walked home. When the clinic closed and there was no nurse left in the valley, the whole hollow started showing up at her door. To have a wound looked at, a fever checked, a blood pressure read, a hard conversation translated out of doctor language and into plain truth. And Eunice, who was retired, who was tired, who was poor, opened her door to every one of them, white and black, young and old. She never charged a soul, and she never turned a soul away. She was, in the eyes of the county that ran that valley, completely and totally invisible. Invisible to the commission that had closed her clinic. Invisible to the company that had cheated her husband. Invisible to a system that had taken everything she and Samuel ever earned and handed back a leaking roof and a collections notice in a kitchen drawer. But she was not invisible to the hollow way. Not to the people, to them. Eunice Caldwell was the closest thing that Broken Valley had to a beating heart. She told the Pruitt children once, while they were eating cornbread at her kitchen table with their boots dripping on her floor, a thing she would say more than once before this story was over. You don't have to have much, she told them, to be the richest person in the room. You just have to be the one who shares it. She meant every word, and the man at the head of that table, the man who would tell her, so politely, that she had somewhere warmer to be. He was about to learn exactly how rich a woman with nothing can be. Now, the afternoon, the ice storm came. The sky over Hollow Creek went the color of a bruise by 2 in the afternoon, and the first freezing rain started ticking against the windows by 3. The radio out of the county seat said the interstate was closing at the ridge. Ice storm warning through the night. Power outages likely across the whole region. Temperatures falling to record lows after dark. Eunice moved through her house the way she had moved through 30 years of hospital shifts, with a calm, unhurried purpose that came from having handled worse. She filled every pot and jar and the bathtub with water, in case the pipes froze. She brought in an armload of Samuel's oak and stacked it by the stove. She checked the oil in the 2 lamps. She laid extra quilts over the back of the Davenport. And then she did one small thing she could not have explained to you if you had asked her. She went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and she lifted out Samuel's heavy canvas barn coat, the one with the wool lining, the one that still, after 8 winters, smelled faintly of him, of pipe, tobacco, and coal, and cold mornings. She carried it down to the front room, and she laid it across the arm of the Davenport. In case somebody's cold tonight, she said to the empty room. She did not know why she said it. She would understand by morning. By 5 o'clock, the freezing rain turned to something worse. A hard, driving ice that coated everything it touched in a half-inch glaze. The power lines along the ridge sagged under the weight of it. The pines bent and cracked. And then, all across the valley, The lights went out at once. The whole of Hollow Creek went black. No streetlights. There were barely any left anyway. No porch lights. No glow from the few houses still lived in. The valley dropped into a darkness so complete that Eunice, standing at her kitchen window, could see the stars, sharp and cold between the breaks in the clouds. The way you never can with the world's lights on, she lit her 2 oil lamps. She set one in the kitchen window, the way her mother had taught her to do in a storm. So anybody lost in the dark would have something to steer by. She set the other on the mantel beside the photograph of Samuel in his Sunday suit. She built up the wood stove until it ticked and roared. And she pulled Samuel's old rocker close to it. And she wrapped herself in a quilt. And she sat, the thermometer nailed to the porch post outside, read 19 below. And the wind was driving it lower than that. It was the kind of cold that is not weather anymore. The kind that is a living thing. That hunts. That gets into a house through every crack and seam and waits for the fire to die. The old house creaked and groaned around her, the joists popping in the cold like knuckles. She was alone, and the night was long. And she settled in to wait it out, the way she had waited out 100 others. But 6 miles up the valley, on the ridge road above Hollow Creek, 6 men were fighting for their lives. They were truckers. A small independent convoy. 3 rigs. Running a load south out of Ohio for a regional outfit called Meridian Freight. There were 6 of them in all. The lead driver was a big man, 58 years old, 26 years behind the wheel, with a gray beard and forearms like bridge cable, and a calm that came from having driven through every kind of weather God ever made. His name was Walt Hennessy. Behind him ran a younger man named Deshawn, and his teammate Carl, and a solo driver named Marcus, who had been hauling 30 years and looked it, and 2 more, a quiet kid named Tyler, on his first winter, and a heavy-set older driver named Roy, whose heart, though none of them knew it yet, was already laboring against the cold and the altitude. They should never have been on that road. And Walt Hennessy knew it. He had watched the weather radar on the tablet in his cab, and he had seen the front folding down over the ridge, hours ahead of schedule. And 26 years behind the wheel had told him exactly what that meant. So he had keyed up the dispatcher, back at Meridian. A man working off a screen, 400 miles away, paid a bonus for on-time delivery and nothing at all for driver safety. And he had asked to lay over and let the storm pass. The dispatcher told him no. The dispatcher told him this load had a delivery bonus riding on it, and that if Walt's convoy did not get over that mountain tonight, the company would cut the whole crew loose and have new drivers on the route by morning. 6 men with families, 6 mortgages, 6 sets of kids. In a business where there is always another hungry driver waiting to take your truck. So they were not fooled. They knew the storm was coming. They were forced to gamble their lives against it. Because the only other choice was losing everything. The front came in 6 hours early. It came in worse than even Walt had feared. By the time the convoy crested the ridge above Hollow Creek, the road had turned to black ice under a skin of freezing rain, and visibility had dropped to nothing. Just the cones of their headlights filling up with horizontal sleet. Walt had them down to 15 miles an hour. Then 10. Crawling. When Roy's rig drifted a foot too far toward the shoulder, caught the ice on the camber of the road, and started to slide. 800 horsepower and 40 tons of steel began, with a terrible slow grace. To jackknife, Roy fought it the way you are trained to fight it, but there is no fighting physics on black ice. The trailer came around. The rig slid sideways down the grade, scraping the guardrail in a long shower of orange sparks, and slewed off the road into the deep, frozen ditch at the bottom, where it came to rest at a sick angle, with the cab half buried in a drift and the engine dead. Walt got his own rig stopped. So did the others. On, easing down to a crawl and then to a halt. Strung out along the ridge, they piled out into the screaming dark and slid down the embankment to Roy. He was alive, but he was gray and gasping and clutching at his left arm. And Walt, who had seen enough on the road in 26 years to know a heart attack when it was looking him in the face, understood in one cold second that they were in serious trouble. There was no cell signal on the ridge. There never was. Walt got on the radio and called for help on every channel, and got nothing back but static and the howl of the wind. The interstate was closed behind them. The road ahead was a sheet of ice dropping down into a dark valley, and Roy was dying in a frozen ditch. And the cold was coming for all of them now. That is when Tyler, the kid, the one on his first winter, pointed down into the black valley below them and said the words that saved 6 lives. There's a light. They all looked, and there, far down, at the bottom of the dead dark valley, where there should have been nothing at all, was a single small point of warm gold light. One window, burning, in a town the dark had swallowed whole. Walt made the call, the way a man like Walt makes calls. Fast and final. They could not move Roy in the rig. They could not wait for help. That was not coming. But they could carry him. 6 men, one of them dying, and one light, 1.5 miles down an iced-over mountain, in the dark. They made a seat for Roy, out of their crossed arms, the way you are taught, and they wrapped him in every coat they had between them. And they started down the mountain toward that one light, sliding and falling and getting up and carrying him on. 6 men and a dying man, and the only hope any of them had glowing gold at the bottom of the world. It took them the better part of an hour. By the time they came off the mountain and onto the frozen dirt of Carver Road, and saw the house the light was coming from, a sagging 2-story, with plastic on the windows and wood smoke on the wind. Every one of them was at the ragged end of what a body can take. Roy was barely conscious. Deshawn had lost the feeling in his feet. Tyler was crying and did not know it, the tears freezing on his face. They climbed the iced porch steps, and Walt, with the last of what he had, raised his fist and pounded on the door, and then all 6 of them, the ones who could still stand, pounded too, because they did not have the strength left to wait politely, because there was a man dying in their arms, because that one gold light was the only thing in 50 miles that had told them they might not die in the dark on that mountain. Inside, by the wood stove, Eunice Caldwell set down her quilt and stood up and went to the door. She opened the door. 6 men filled her porch in the dark. Snow and ice caked over every inch of them, breath pouring off them like smoke. And in the middle of them, held up in their crossed arms, a heavy-set gray-faced man whose eyes were rolling and whose lips had gone the blue-white of a body shutting down. Most people would have flinched. Most people in that valley, seeing 6 strangers loom up out of a black blizzard on their porch at 7 at night, would have slammed that door and thrown the bolt and reached for the phone. Eunice Caldwell took one look, not at the strangeness and the size of them, but at the gray man in their arms, and her whole 30 years of nursing came up in her at once. And the first words out of her mouth were not, "Who are you?" and were not, "What do you want?" The first words out of her mouth were, "Bring him in here. Lay him down by the stove. Now." She held the door wide, and they came through it, ducking their heads under the low frame. 6 big men crowding into her small front room until their shoulders touched the walls. And the whole place filled up with the smell of cold leather and frozen road and diesel. Ice melted off them and pooled on her plank floor. She paid it no mind at all. She was already moving. Lay him flat. Feet up. Put that cushion under his feet. Get that wet coat off him. Her voice had changed. It was not the soft voice she used with the Pruitt children. It was the other voice. The one nobody in that valley had heard in years. The steel calm voice of a charge nurse on a ward. The voice that men twice her size obeyed without thinking, because it left no room in the air for anything but obeying. They laid Roy on the rag rug in front of the wood stove, and they did exactly what she said. She was on her knees beside him before he was all the way down. 71 years old. On the cold plank floor, 2 fingers already at the side of his throat. Her head cocked, counting. His pulse was fast and thready and wrong. His skin was cold and damp. She pulled back an eyelid. She put her ear to his chest and listened. And what she heard there made her mouth go thin. "How long has his arm been hurting him?" she asked. Not looking up, Walt stared. "How did you—" "Because he is grabbing it in his sleep. And he is gray as ash. And his heart is running like a rabbit," she said. "I was a nurse, 30 years. So, and what this man is having is a heart attack, and he has been having it a good while. And he is not going to keep having it much longer. Unless we get smart. Right now, is there aspirin in any of your pockets? Anybody plain aspirin?" Deshawn, shaking, dug a travel tin out of his coat and spilled it into her palm. She got 2 of them between Roy's teeth and told him to chew. Told him, "Chew, baby. Chew them up." And the gray man chewed. She had Deshawn and Tyler get the wet clothes off, Roy down to his undershirt, and she packed quilts around him. Not on top, around. The way you do it, trapping the body's own heat. She got his feet up higher and his head flat, and she knelt there with her 2 fingers on his pulse. And she did the one thing that nobody who had not done it for 30 years would have known how to do, which was to be the steady, calm center of a room full of panic. To be the still point everything else could hold on to. "Listen to me," she said to him, low, close to his ear. "I have set bigger fires than the one in your chest, and I have put every one of them out. And I am not about to let you die on my floor and make a liar out of me. So, you are going to breathe slow, and you are going to stay right here with me, and you are going to be all right. You here. You stay with Eunice. Roy stayed with Eunice. It took 20 of the longest minutes any of those men had ever lived through. But the aspirin did its work. And the warmth did its work. And the simple animal comfort of being flat and warm and told by a calm voice that he would live did its work. And slowly, the gray drained out of Roy's face, and a little color came back, and his pulse under her fingers steadied and slowed and found its rhythm, and his eyes cleared, and he looked up at the lined brown face of the old woman kneeling over him on the floor, and he started to cry. "It's all right," she told him, and she wiped his face with the corner of her own apron. "It's all right now. You're all right. You just lie there and you rest." Only then, only once, she was sure the man was not going to die. Did Eunice Caldwell get up off that floor? Slow, with both hands on her bad knees, and look around at the 5 other half-frozen strangers filling up her house, and become, again, the other person she was. "Now then," she said, "sit down, all of you, wherever you can find a spot, before you fall down. And one of you tell me which of you cannot feel his feet, because I can see it on a face from here." That was Deshawn. She sat him down and pulled off his soaked boots and his socks and took his white, wax-cold feet between her 2 warm hands, and she rubbed them, slow and firm, on her knees again on that cold floor, working the blood back down into the toes while he hissed and gritted his teeth at the burn of it coming back. She rubbed until the white went pink. Then she pulled off her own thick wool socks, right there, and worked them onto his feet. "Those are my good socks," she said. "Don't you go to Ohio in my good socks. Now." Deshawn laughed. A cracked, exhausted, helpless laugh. And it was the first time any of those 6 men had laughed since the ridge. Then she went to work on the next problem, which was food. She had a pot of pinto beans she had put on that afternoon, simmering low at the back of the stove with a ham hock in it. Enough, she had figured, to make her 3 or 4 suppers across the next week. She looked at that pot, and she looked at 6 big men who had carried a dying friend 1.5 miles down a frozen mountain on empty stomachs. And she did the arithmetic in her head, the same arithmetic she had been doing her whole life. Take what there is, and make it stretch to cover everybody but yourself. She poured more water into the beans. She found a sleeve of crackers and the better part of a pan of cornbread she had baked that morning, and she cut the cornbread into smaller pieces than she would have liked, so it would go around. She opened her last 2 jars of the tomatoes she had canned the summer before and stirred them in to make the beans go further. She set out a jar of chow-chow she had put up in the fall, and a stick of butter, and she ladled it all into every bowl and cup and mug she owned, because she did not have 6 matching bowls. She had not needed more than 2 in 8 years. She served all 6 of them. Roy first, propped up now, and able to take a little broth. Then the rest. She did not make a bowl for herself, Walt noticed. Violet. It would turn out. Noticed everything. "Ma'am," he said, "you are not eating—" "I had my supper before you all came," she said. She had not. There was nothing left in the pot but what was in their bowls. And Walt Hennessy looked at the empty pot and looked at the old woman, and understood exactly what she had just done. and something moved across his weathered face that he did not have a word for. Now the cold? These men were soaked to the skin and shivering down to the bone. She moved through that house, gathering up every warm thing in it. The quilts off both beds, a wool blanket from the cedar chest, an Afghan her own grandmother had crocheted 70 years before in Alabama. And then she went to the Davenport, and she picked up Samuel's heavy canvas barn coat, the one she had laid out that afternoon. Without knowing why, she carried it to Walt. He was the biggest of them, and the coldest, standing by the wall because there was not a chair left big enough. "Put this on," she said. "It was my husband's." Walt looked at the coat. He looked at her. He understood. The way you understand some things, without being told, exactly what it cost her to take a dead man's coat out of a cedar chest and put it on the back of a stranger. He took it and put it on, and it fit him, almost like it had been cut for him. "Thank you, Mom," he said, and his voice was not steady when he said it. By 9 o'clock, she had 6 warm, dry men, where an hour before there had been 6 dying ones, and she still had not asked a single one of them their name. While all this was happening, Walt Hennessy was watching the house. He did not say much. He just sat by the stove in a dead man's coat and watched. The way a man who has spent 26 years reading roads and weather and people reads a room, and the room told him a story. He saw the galvanized washtub at the top of the pull-down attic stairs, set there to catch a leak, and the brown water stains spreading across the ceiling above it. He saw the plastic sheeting taped over every window, gone yellow and brittle, peeling at the corners where the cold got in. He saw that there was no furnace running anywhere in that house, just the one wood stove, and beside it, a carefully stacked, carefully rationed pile of split oak that a man had clearly cut a long time ago, because the woman tending it touched each piece before she fed it to the fire, like she was saying goodbye to it. He saw the photographs on the wall, a wedding picture, faded. This same woman, young and beautiful and fierce-eyed, beside a big, quiet-looking man in a dark suit. A picture of that same man in coveralls and a hard hat with a miner's lamp, standing with a crew of other men, black with coal dust, all of them grinning. A picture of the woman herself, younger, in a nurse's cap, surrounded by a crowd of newborns and exhausted, happy mothers. And he saw, on the wall, by the stove, where you would hang a Bible or a cross, a worn black book on a nail, not a Bible, a ledger, alum, silim, hard-used record book with a cracked spine, the kind they kept the books in, down at a union hall, hanging on a nail in a poor woman's house, like the most precious thing she owned, which, it would turn out, it nearly was. He did not ask about it. Not yet. The men talked, the way men do when they have come through something together, and the danger is past, and the warmth has loosened them up. And Eunice listened. Really listened. The way she had listened to 30 years of dying men. The way that made a person feel like the thing they were saying was the most important thing anyone had ever said to her. Marcus, the 30-year man, talked about how the roads were not the same anymore, how the companies pushed harder every year, how a dispatcher 400 miles away, on a salary and a bonus, would put a man on a mountain in an ice storm and call it the driver's fault if he died. That is the part that made Eunice look up from her rocker. "Say that again," she said. Walt set down his cup. "I want to be clear about something." "Mom?" "Because it matters," he said. "We were not fools up there. I have driven 26 years. I looked at the radar in my cab, and I saw that storm coming down early. Plain as day. I got on the radio, and I asked my dispatcher to let us lay over and wait it out. That is the right call. That is the safe call. Any driver alive would have made it." He shook his head slow, and the man 400 miles away told me no. He told me this load had a bonus on it, and that if we did not get over that mountain tonight, the company would fire the whole crew and have new drivers on the route by morning. 6 of us. 6 families. So it was not that we believed him about the weather. We knew better than him about the weather. It is that he made us choose. Right there. Between the mountain and our family's next meal. He forced us to bet our lives, to keep our jobs. He looked at the fire. Company called Meridian Freight. They do it all the time. Everybody in the business knows it. And when the dice come up bad, it is our license on the line and our family at the funeral. And the company writes it off and hires the next man. Eunice was quiet for a long moment, rocking, watching the fire. And then she said, in a voice that had gone very level and very far away, "They forced you to bet your life to keep your job." She said it slow, like she was turning it over, like it was a thing she had heard before in a different shape. "My husband worked 31 years in a hole in the ground for a company that did the exact same arithmetic. Send the men into the part of the seam you know is not shored, right? Because stopping to do it safe costs money. And there is always another man, hungry enough to take the risk. They gave him black lung and a pension worth about a tank of gas. And they fought his benefits in a courtroom until 6 weeks after I put him in the ground. So, no. So, you do not have to tell me how a company does a working man. It is the same company. It is always the same company, wearing a different name." She looked at the fire. "I have been keeping the books on exactly that for a long time." And she looked, just for a second, at the black ledger hanging on the nail by the stove. Deshawn followed her eyes. "What is the book?" "Ma'am, if you do not mind." Eunice was quiet a moment longer. Then she got up, slow, both hands on her knees, and she took the ledger down off the nail and held it in her 2 hands like you would hold a sleeping child. And she came and sat back down with it in her lap. "This was my Samuel's," she said. "He was a union man. Back when there was a union in this valley, worth the name, and Samuel had a way about him. He did not yell. He did not carry on. But he believed that the only thing a working man has got against a company that has got all the lawyers and all the money is the truth. Written down. Dates. Names. Who promised what? And who broke it? Every time the company cheated a man in this hollow, shorted his pay, denied his claim, sent him into a part of the mine they knew was not shored right. Samuel wrote it down in this book. Every broken promise, and every time the union helped a man, got him his back pay, got a widow, her benefits, got the company to fix what they swore they would fix. He wrote that down too." She ran her hand over the cracked cover. "He used to say a company's whole power is that everybody forgets what they promised, forgets what they did. So you write it down, you keep the book, and one day, when the time is right and the people are ready, you open the book and you read it back to them in front of God and everybody, and you watch what forgetting was holding up fall down. She fell silent. The fire popped. 6 strangers sat in a dead miner's house and looked at the record of every wrong a company had ever done that valley, kept on a nail like a holy thing. He never got to read it back. Eunice said quietly. He got sick. And then the mine closed. And the union folded. And the people scattered. And it did not seem like there was anybody left to read it to. So it just hangs there. 40-some years of the truth, just hanging on a nail. She looked at the fire. But I keep it. Because Samuel was right about the part that matters. They count on you forgetting. So I do not forget. That is the one thing I can still do for him. And for all of them. I do not forget. Walt Hennessy looked at that ledger. And then he looked around again, at the leaking roof, and the plastic windows, and the rationed wood, and the empty bean pot. And a man who had spent his whole adult life watching companies grind down the people who serve them, who had himself nearly died that night, because a man 400 miles away rolled the dice with his life, sat very still, and felt something turning over in his chest that would not let him rest until he had done something about it. But he did not say a word. Not yet. Deshawn pulled out his phone and, because there was nothing else to do, and the night was long, showed Eunice a picture of his little girl, 4 years old, hair in beads, gap-toothed grin. Tyler, the kid, finally stopped shaking enough to talk, and told her in a low voice that his daddy had driven a truck and died in a wreck like the one they had almost had, and that his mama had told him not to take this job, and that he had been so scared up on that ridge that he had prayed for the first time since he was little. Eunice took the boy's hand and held it, and told him there was no shame in praying, and no shame in being scared. That being scared and doing the thing anyway was the whole entire definition of being brave. And Roy, old Roy, propped up by the fire, alive, kept looking at her across the room with the wet, raw look of a man who knew exactly how close he had come, and exactly who had stood between him and it. By 1 a.m, the men were asleep, stretched out on her floor and her Davenport and Samuel's rocker. 6 huge men crammed into a tiny front room, wrapped in 70-year-old Afghans, breathing slow. Eunice did not sleep. She sat up in a kitchen chair, and she fed the stove, and she kept watch over 6 strangers, like they were her own children. The way she had kept watch over 1,000 strangers in 30 years of night shifts. And around 3 a.m, she got up quiet. And she took the last of her flour and the last of her lard and the little bit of buttermilk in the icebox. And she made biscuits from scratch by lamplight on a wood stove at 3 a.m, in the middle of an ice storm that had killed the power in 3 counties, so that 6 men she had known for 8 hours would have something hot in their bellies before they faced the mountain again. She set them under a clean towel on the counter, and then she sat back down and tended the fire and waited for the sun. Hold on, I have to stop right here. This woman, who is broke, who owes $3,100 she cannot pay, who is heating her house with her dead husband's firewood and rationing it like gold. She gave away her food, her blankets, her good socks, her husband's coat, and now she is up at 3 in the morning baking biscuits for 6 strangers. Man, if that was me, I do not know. I really do not know if I would have even opened the door. And she did not think twice, not once. Keep that in your mind, because of where this is about to go. Because the next morning, those 6 men found out exactly who she was, and not one of them ever forgot it. The sun came up over the ridge, and the storm was over. Morning light came soft and gold through the plastic-covered windows. The wind had died in the night. 2 feet of snow and a hard glaze of ice lay over the whole valley, and the world outside was painfully, blindingly white and silent and clean. The men woke one at a time, stiff and sore, blinking, and then they smelled it. Coffee, the last of Eunice's tin of it, and biscuits, hot and golden under a towel, and a jar of the blackberry preserve she had put up the summer before. 6 big men crowded around a kitchen table built for 2, elbows knocking, knees against the wall, eating hot biscuits with homemade jam in a poor woman's kitchen by lamplight. And every one of them ate like it was the finest meal he had ever had in his life. Because right then, it was. Roy, color full back in his face, ate slow and careful, and watched Eunice the whole time. Tyler ate 4 biscuits and went red when she caught him reaching for the 5th. And she told him to go on and take it. That is what it was there for. When they had finished, Walt pushed back from the table. He reached into his coat. Samuel's coat, dry now and warm, and he pulled out a fold of cash, the road money he carried, several $100s at least, and he set it on the table by Eunice's hand. "Ma'am," he said, "we cannot begin to pay you for what you did. Roy would be dead, probably half of us. So this is not payment, because there is no paying it. But please, take it. For the food, for the wood, for your husband's coat. Please." Eunice looked at the money on her table. She did not touch it. She pushed it back across the table toward Walt. Slow, steady, with 2 fingers, the way she had done 100 small kindnesses in her life, with no anger in it at all, just a quiet, bedrock certainty. "Put that away," she said. "I did not open my door for money. I opened it because there were men dying on my porch, and I had a warm fire, and that is the beginning and the end of it. If I had taken money for it, it would not have been worth doing. You put that back in your pocket, and you do not say another word about it." The kitchen went quiet. Walt looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes went bright. And the big man blinked hard and looked away and put the money back in his pocket. Because there are some women you do not argue with, and Eunice Caldwell was at the very top of that list. "Then, at least," he said, his voice rough, "let me ask your name. I have slept in your husband's coat and eaten your last biscuit, and I do not even know your name. Eunice Caldwell. And this was your husband's house, and his coat, and his book on the wall? Samuel Caldwell," she said. 31 years in the mine. Union man. Best man this valley ever made. Walt nodded, slow, He looked at the ledger on its nail. He looked at the leaking ceiling, and the plastic windows, and the rationed wood, and the empty bean pot, and the proud old woman in front of him, who had given 6 strangers everything she had, and pushed his money back across the table like it had offended her. And then Walt Hennessy did something. But it was not pulling out a checkbook. It was not revealing that he was secretly a rich man. Because he was not. He was a trucker with cracked hands and a second mortgage, same as the rest of them. What he did was quieter than that. And as it turned out, it was bigger than any check could have been. He took out his phone and he said, "Mrs. Caldwell, last night you near about died right along with us. In this cold house, with this leaking roof, because the county let your clinic close and put your nearest hospital 50 miles up an iced-over mountain. And we near about died on that mountain. Because a company called Meridian Freight rolled the dice with our lives to save a delivery time. Now, I am just a truck driver, but I have been a truck driver for 26 years. And in 26 years, I have learned exactly one thing that is worth anything." He held up the phone. The companies and the county commissions and all the rest of them, their whole power is that nobody is watching, and nobody remembers, and nobody writes it down. You taught me that last night, sitting right there, telling me about your Samuel's book. So, he looked at her. "I would like your permission to write it down. All of it. What happened to us on that ridge? What happened to your clinic? What this valley has been let to come to. I have got a brother-in-law who is a reporter at the paper in the capital, and a cousin who does safety law for the Truckers Association, and about 4,000 drivers who follow me on account of I have been around forever, and I tell the truth. Last night you kept Samuel's book. Let me help you open it." Eunice Caldwell looked at the big trucker in her dead husband's coat for a long, long time. And then, for the first time in that whole night and morning, the steel in her face cracked, and underneath it was something that had not been there in a long time. Not hope. Exactly. Something harder and better than hope. Purpose. Samuel always said, she said slowly, that you keep the book until the people are ready. And then you read it back to them in front of God, and everybody. She looked at the ledger on its nail. I have had this book on that nail for 8 years, thinking there was nobody left to read it to. She looked back at Walt. Maybe I was wrong about that. Before they left, the men worked. They cleared the ice off her porch steps and salted them with grit from a bag in the shed. Tyler split a fresh stack of oak from the woodpile and carried it in and built the rack back up. So, she would not have to ration Samuel's wood quite so hard. Deshawn fixed the screen door that had hung crooked for 2 years with a tool from his pocket. Without being asked, Marcus climbed up into the attic and put a proper tarp and a board over the worst of the roof leak. A patch. Not a fix, but enough to keep the water off through the rest of the winter. They worked for an hour. In the way you work, when there is no way to say thank you, that is big enough, and so you say it with your hands instead. Roy was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway, and he took both of Eunice's hands in both of his, and he could not get the words out for a moment. When he did, his voice broke on them. You stood between me and it, he said. I felt it leaving, and you reached down and you pulled me back. I have got grandbabies. Mum, I am going to see them grow up now. Because of you. Eunice patted his big hands. You go home, and you hug those grandbabies, she said. And you tell that company you are not running another mountain in a storm for any delivery time on God's earth. You hear me? He nodded. He could not speak. He went. She stood in the doorway and watched the 6 of them make their way back up the white mountain toward their rigs, getting smaller and smaller against the snow, until the road curved and they were gone. Then she went back inside and closed the door and sat at her kitchen table and finished her coffee alone. And on the wall by the stove, the black ledger hung on its nail, the way it had for 8 years. But something had changed, and both Eunice and that book knew it. For about 10 days, nothing happened. And Eunice, who had been disappointed by the world enough times to know better than to wait on it, I figured that was the end of it. She was wrong. It started small. A reporter from the Capital paper called her landline Walt's brother-in-law, a soft-spoken man named Hollis, who had grown up in a coal town 2 valleys over and knew exactly what he was looking at. He did not want a sob story, he said. He wanted the facts. The clinic, the closure vote, the 50-mile emergency room, the ice storm, the truckers, the ledger. He drove out to Carver Road on the next clear day, and he sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. And Eunice, who had spent 10 years as a steward, learning that the truth written down is the only weapon a poor person has, gave him facts, dates, names, the minutes of the commission meeting where they had voted to close the clinic, which she had, of course, kept a copy of, because Eunice Caldwell did not forget and did not throw things away. And she took Samuel's ledger down off the nail, and she opened it for Hollis, and she let him photograph the pages. 40 years of a company's broken promises to a valley, written in a dead miner's careful hand. The story ran 2 weeks later. On the front page, above the fold, and it was the kind of story that gets read in a state capital, a forgotten coal town, a clinic the county closed in a near-empty meeting, an old nurse who had become the only health care for 50 miles, 6 truckers, a freight company nearly killed on the ridge above her house, and a dying miner's ledger that had been quietly recording 4 decades of exactly this kind of thing. It went everywhere. The reporter had done his work. He had pulled Meridian Freight's safety record and found the pattern Walt described. He had pulled the county's budget and found that the money saved by closing the clinic had quietly gone toward a tax break for an out-of-state holding company that had promised 200 jobs and delivered 40. But it was Eunice who found the thing that turned the whole story from sad to damning. The night the reporter sat at her table, she made him write down the name of that holding company. And then she went to the wall, and she took down Samuel's ledger. And she sat under the lamp, and she turned those 40 years of careful handwriting 1 page at a time, the way she had 100 times before. And about halfway through, on a page dated 1985, she stopped, and she put her finger on a name, and her hand was not quite steady when she turned the book around to show the reporter what her husband had written down 40 years before any of them were born to it. Because the out-of-state holding company that the county had handed the clinic's money to was not a stranger to that valley at all. It was a subsidiary, a grandchild, 3 corporate names removed, of the very coal company that had taken Samuel's lungs and his pension and fought his widow in court. The new devils and the old devils were the same devils. They had just changed their name and come back for the rest. And the county commission, which had closed that clinic, in a meeting nobody came to, was suddenly forced to do the one thing it had spent 2 years avoiding. They had to schedule a public hearing, because suddenly people were coming, because suddenly the cameras were coming, because suddenly the thing they had counted on, that nobody was watching, and nobody remembered, and nobody had written it down, was no longer true. They held the hearing in the old county courthouse in the county seat, the biggest room in 50 miles, and that is where we came in. The courtroom was full. For the first time in living memory, it was full. It was full of the people of the Hollow, the Pruitt family, old Doris, the Hatfield boy, white and black, young and old, the whole scattered, forgotten valley, come down out of the hills. It was full of reporters and cameras, and up at the long table on the raised platform sat the commissioners in their suits. And at the center of them sat the chairman, a heavy-set man with a politician's tan, and a gavel he liked the sound of, and down the center aisle, slow, with her dead husband's union ledger held against her chest in her 2 hands, walked Eunice Caldwell, 71 years old, in her good Sunday dress. The chairman did not know her. That was his first mistake. He saw an old black woman in a worn dress walking up the aisle of his courtroom, and he made the same calculation that the company had made about Samuel, and that the county had made about that valley for 40 years. He decided she was nobody. He decided she was powerless. He decided he could handle her the way he handled every inconvenience, with procedure, and a glance at his watch, and the quiet authority of a man who controlled the room. So he did not wait for her to reach the podium. He set his pen down with a small, deliberate click, and he folded his hands, and he spoke into his microphone in a calm, measured, almost kindly voice. Mrs. Caldwell, we have read the newspaper article. What you did, sheltering those men, was very admirable. The room went quiet, but this is a budget hearing on the macro-fiscal position of this county. It is not the place for sentimental personal stories, and it is not a charity window. Your name is not on the list of registered speakers, and we simply do not have the time. Eunice Caldwell did not flinch. She simply stood there, in the center aisle, her spine straight, her husband's ledger held against her chest. The chairman gave that thin, patient smile. I am going to have to ask you to step away from the floor, he said, before I am obliged to call security. I am sure a woman of your years has somewhere warmer to be. He sat back. He folded his arms. He thought it was over. He thought she would gather up her notebook and shrink away, embarrassed. The way the unregistered and the powerless always had in that room. And here is the thing. That, right there, was so much worse than if he had screamed at her, because a man screaming a slur, the cameras catch that, and the whole world knows what he is. But a man in a good suit, speaking softly about procedure and registered speakers and macro-fiscal position, telling a poor old woman so very politely that she does not belong, that her clinic is a sentimental story and her life is not worth the agenda's time. That is the real machine. That is how it actually works. That is how they close a clinic in an empty room and call it fiscal responsibility. And Eunice Caldwell had spent 10 years as a union steward learning exactly how to take that machine apart. For a long moment, she did not move and did not speak. She let his polite little dismissal hang in that silent room where everyone could hear it, where the cameras could catch it. And then she spoke, and she did not raise her voice. Because Eunice Caldwell never raised her voice, she just answered him in his own language. "Mr. Chairman, you are correct," she said. "I am not on the list of registered speakers. Under this commission's own public comment rule, Section 4, any county resident may be recognized to speak on an agenda item at the discretion of the chair or upon the motion of any seated member. I helped write the public comment rules for the hospital board under the same county code, Sir, about 20 years before you held that gavel. So I would respectfully ask the chair to recognize me. And if the chair declines..." She turned, unhurried, and looked along the long table at the other commissioners, and then out at the packed and watching room, and then up at the cameras. Then I would ask that the chair state, for the record, and for these cameras, that he is refusing to let a 46-year resident of this county speak about the clinic her tax dollars used to fund, because that is a sentence I think you would rather not have on tape. Mr. Chairman, now, shall I continue, or shall we put your refusal in the minutes? The room did not make a sound, and the chairman, who had counted on procedure to remove her, discovered that the woman in the worn dress knew the procedure better than he did, and had just used it to trap him in front of every camera in the state. His thin, patient smile was gone. After a moment, a commissioner, 2 seats down, cleared his throat and said, quietly, "I will move to recognize Mrs. Caldwell." There was no way, with the cameras running, to say no. Eunice walked the rest of the way to the podium, slow and unhurried, and she set the ledger down on it. And she opened a worn folder beside it. "Thank you," she said. Now, the chairman called this a budget hearing, and he is right. So, let us talk about the budget. Let us talk about resources. Since he raised it 2 winters ago, in a meeting in this very building that 11 people attended, you and the men beside you voted to close the Hollow Creek Clinic. You said it was to save the county money. I have the minutes of that meeting right here. And I have the line items from the county budget. And I did what a steward does. I followed the money. The money you saved by closing the only doctor for 50 miles. You did not save it all. You handed it to an out-of-state holding company in a tax break, in exchange for a promise of 200 jobs. That company brought 40, and 3 of those left last spring. So here is the first truth. Sir, in front of God, and these cameras, you did not close that clinic to stop a drain on this county. You closed a clinic that served the poor, and the old, and the black. And you gave the money to a company that lied to you about the jobs. And you never once checked, because you were counting on the same thing every man at that table has always counted on, that nobody was watching, and nobody remembered, and nobody had written it down. She let that settle, and then she put her hand flat on the black ledger, and her voice dropped, and got, if anything, even quieter, and the whole room leaned in to hear it. But you want to know the part that I could not stop thinking about. Once I followed the money all the way to the end, this holding company you were so eager to please, I had my friend write down its name for me. And then I sat up that night with this book, my husband's book, and I read it the way I have read it 100 times. And I found that name, not the same name. Exactly. Sir, they are clever about that. They change the name every time the public gets too good a look at them. But you follow the ownership back, the way Samuel taught me to, parent to parent to parent. And the out-of-state holding company that you closed our clinic to enrich is a subsidiary. It is the grandchild. 3 corporate names removed, of the very same coal company that put my Samuel in a part of the seam they knew was not safe, that filled his lungs with rock dust, that cut his pension to a tank of gas, and that fought a dying man's benefits in a courtroom until 6 weeks after I buried him. The courtroom had gone utterly still. I know it is the same company, Eunice said, because my husband wrote their name in this book, in his own hand. In 1985, she held the open page up to the light, to the cameras. So, understand what you did, Mr. Chairman. And what this county did, you took the health of this whole valley, the clinic, the doctor, the ambulance that might have reached me when I lay on my own steps with 2 broken ribs, and you handed it, for a tax break, to the same devils who already took everything my husband had and then took him too. You sold us back to the people who were killing us 40 years ago. They just changed their name and came back for the rest of us. And not one of you looked, because you were counting on the fact that the only man who ever wrote their name down was already dead. She laid her hand on the ledger. He is, but I am not. And I kept his book. A sound moved through the courtroom that was not quite a murmur and not quite a sob. The chairman's face had drained of all its color a moment ago. Eunice went on. You told me, very kindly, that a woman of my years surely has somewhere warmer to be. So, let me tell you about the warm place I have. Last winter, I slipped on my own iced-over front steps, and I cracked 2 ribs, and I lay there in the cold, alone, and I could not get up. And do you know how long it took for help to reach me? Because the clinic that used to sit 4 blocks from my house was closed. By you. The ambulance had to come 50 miles, over a frozen mountain. And when it was done, they sent me a bill for $3,100 that I cannot pay. And that bill is sitting in my kitchen drawer right now. Her voice never rose. It only got clearer. That is the warm place I have. Sir, that is what your vote did to one old woman. And I am the lucky one. I am the one who lived. I have buried neighbors in this valley who did not. She lifted the ledger off the podium then, and she held it up where every camera in the room could see it. You called my story sentimental, she said. You called this a charity window. Let me tell you what this book actually is. It belonged to my husband, Samuel Caldwell. He worked 31 years in the mine that built the wealth this county was raised on. He died of black lung that mine gave him, fighting for benefits that a company's lawyers denied him until 6 weeks after I put him in the ground. And for 40 years, Samuel kept this book. Every promise a company made to a man in this valley, and every promise it broke. He wrote it down, right here, because Samuel understood the one thing that you are counting on these people not to understand. She turned, slow, and faced the whole courtroom. Her room now, the Valley's room, their whole power, she said, is that you forget. They close your clinic in an empty room, and they count on you forgetting. A company rolls the dice with a trucker's life on the mountain above your house, and they count on the funeral coming and going, and everybody forgetting. They take a working man's lungs and his pension, and they count on his widow being too tired and too poor and too alone to ever stand up and read it back to them. Her hand rested flat on the ledger. And for 8 years, that is exactly what I was, Breck. Too tired, too alone. I kept this book on a nail by my stove, thinking there was nobody left in this valley to read it to. She paused. And then, 3 weeks ago, 6 strangers came to my door in an ice storm, half frozen, one of them dying of a heart attack on my front room floor. They were truckers, driven up onto that mountain by a company that threatened to fire all 6 of them and their families if they would not gamble their lives on the ice that night to save a delivery time. They were dying on the same 50-mile mountain that your closed clinic created. And I sat up all night with those men. And I learned something, Sir, that you would do well to learn. I learned that this valley is not too tired anymore, and it is not too alone, because there were 6 strangers willing to carry a dying man 1.5 miles down a frozen mountain in the dark, rather than leave him. And if 6 strangers will do that for each other, then I have got no business keeping this book on a nail one day longer. She set it down. She put her hand on top of it, and she looked up at the chairman, who was no longer smug, who was gripping the edge of his table, whose face had gone from red to a sick pale. So here is what is going to happen, said Eunice Caldwell. And it was not a question, and it was not a plea. It was a steward stating terms. You are going to reopen that clinic. You are going to find the money the very same way you found it the first time, because it was always there. And I have shown this whole room exactly where it went. And you are going to do it knowing that the cameras are here now, and the reporters are here now, and 4,000 truck drivers are watching now. And this whole valley is awake now. And this book, she patted it once, is open now, and it is going to stay open. A few minutes ago, Sir, you told me, so politely, that I did not belong on this floor, and that I had somewhere warmer to be. She let that sit. Well, this is where I belong, right here, in front of you, with this book open, with this valley behind me, and I am not going anywhere. For 1 full second, the courtroom was completely silent, and then old Doris stood up in the back, and then the Hatfield boy stood up, and then the Pruitt family stood up, all of them, the little ones too, and then the whole valley was on its feet at once. The whole forgotten hollow, standing up together in that courthouse. And the sound that filled that room was the loudest thing those walls had heard in 50 years. And the chairman, who 20 minutes earlier had folded his hands and told a poor black widow, so very politely, that she had somewhere warmer to be. The chairman just sat there. He did not reach for his gavel. He could not have made himself heard over that valley if he had. He sat in his suit on his raised platform, in front of every camera in the state, and he watched the most powerful moment of his career belong, completely and totally, to the woman he had tried, so politely, to send back out into the cold. Yo, I had to stop the edit right here, because this is it. This is the whole thing. She did not get saved by a rich man on her porch. She did not get rescued. She took her husband's book down off the nail, and she walked into that courthouse, and she let that smug man in his good suit dismiss her. So politely, in front of the whole world, telling her she did not belong and had somewhere warmer to be. And then she stood up, calm as Sunday morning, and she took his entire corrupt system apart, brick by brick, with nothing but his own rules and the truth written down. Read back. That is not luck. That is not a handout. That is a woman who was somebody this entire time. And the only thing that changed is that the world finally had to look. But this story does not end in that courtroom. Because a black story worth telling never ends with one room standing up. It ends with what the standing up changes. The clip of that hearing. The chairman, in his good suit, smoothly telling a 71-year-old widow that she did not belong on the floor and had somewhere warmer to be. And then that same widow, calmly dismantling him and his whole system in front of the entire valley. That clip went everywhere. It ran on the television stations that night. It got picked up by The Wire. It was shared and reshared until the whole state had seen it, and a man who had counted his whole career on nobody watching discovered, all at once, that everybody was. 3 months later, the Hollow Creek Clinic reopened its doors. It did not happen because a commissioner had a change of heart. It happened because the cameras stayed, and the reporter kept writing, and the truckers kept watching, and Eunice Caldwell kept the book open. And a county commission that had counted on being invisible found that it no longer was. They found the money exactly where she had told them it was. They reopened the clinic in the same little brick building, 4 blocks from Eunice's house, where it had always been, with a nurse practitioner and a visiting doctor 2 days a week, and an actual ambulance stationed in the bay, so that no one in that valley would ever again have to choose between a 50-mile drive over an iced mountain and dying at home in the dark. The chairman did not vote to reopen it. The chairman, as it turned out, did not get to vote on much of anything after that. The footage of what he said followed him everywhere he went. And at the next election, the people of that county, the people who had stood up in that courtroom, turned out in numbers nobody had seen in a generation. And they voted him out. And they voted in a young woman from the Hollow who had grown up going to that very clinic. The system did not just bend. A piece of it broke off and was replaced by the people it had spent 40 years ignoring. They asked Eunice to cut the ribbon at the clinic. She almost said no. She had never once done a thing for the cameras. And she was not about to start. But the Pruitt children begged her. And old Doris told her she had earned the right to a pair of scissors if anybody ever had. So she stood at the door of that little brick clinic in her Sunday dress. And she cut the ribbon. And when the reporter asked her how it felt, she said, "It feels like the clinic is open. That is all I ever wanted. I just want people to be able to get a doctor when they are sick. That is not charity. That is just decent." And the story did not stop at the county line, because it turned out Hollow Creek was not the only valley with a closed clinic and a 50-mile mountain and an old somebody holding it all together alone. The capital paper ran a series. The state legislature, which had not thought about rural clinics in 20 years, suddenly held hearings. Because suddenly, it was the thing everyone was watching. Within a year, 2 more clinics in 2 more forgotten valleys reopened, and a bill that nobody had been able to move for a decade. A bill requiring the state to study and fund emergency care in the counties the hospitals had abandoned. Passed both houses, and on the day it was signed, the governor mentioned a coal town nurse and a dead miner's ledger by name and Meridian Freight. The Truckers Association lawsuit, built on the pattern Walt described, and the reporter documented, forced the whole thing into the open. The on-time bonuses that paid dispatchers to gamble with drivers' lives were dragged into a courtroom and into the newspapers, and Meridian, facing the lawsuit, the publicity, and 4,000 drivers who would no longer haul for them, was forced to gut the entire system. They eliminated the safety blind bonus structure. They gave drivers an absolute, unquestionable right to refuse a run in dangerous weather, without retaliation. They wrote it into the contract. And the Truckers Association made it model language and started pushing it at every freight company in the region, so that somewhere, on some future ridge, in some future ice storm, a driver who did not want to gamble his life would have the right to say no, and would live because 6 men got stranded above Hollow Creek, and an old woman opened her door. Walt came back. That spring. So did Roy, and Deshawn, and Marcus, and Tyler. All of them, driving out to Carver Road on a clear Saturday to see the clinic and to see Eunice. Roy brought his grandbabies, the ones he had lived to see grow up, and he set the littlest one in Eunice's lap. And Eunice held that baby like she had known her all her life. Tyler, the scared kid from the ridge, had quit the long haul and gone home and enrolled in nursing school. And when he told Eunice that, the steel in her face cracked all the way open, and she took his face in both her hands and said, "Well, now, look what came down off that mountain." And the ledger came down off the nail for good. Not because Eunice stopped keeping it. She would never stop keeping it. But because the people of Hollow Creek, the whole awake and standing valley, took up a collection, and over Eunice's strong objections, they had Samuel's ledger professionally restored and rebound. And they built a small glass case for it. And they hung it on the wall of the reopened clinic, open to the page in Samuel Caldwell's careful hand, where anyone who walked in could read it, so that nobody who came to that clinic would ever forget what it cost, or how close they had come to losing it, or the one true thing a dying miner had known, that their whole power is that you forget, so do not. And the roof. The county did not fix Eunice's roof, and Eunice would never have asked them to, but the valley fixed it. The Hatfield boy, who knew construction, organized it, and on a warm Saturday in May, 30 people from the Hollow showed up on Carver Road with lumber and shingles in a borrowed truck, and they tore off the old leaking roof and put on a new one. And they fixed the windows so she could finally take down the plastic. And they put in a small, efficient furnace so that a 71-year-old woman would not have to ration her dead husband's firewood through another winter. They worked all day, white and black, young and old, the whole valley she had carried for 40 years, carrying her. Just once. Just a little. The way she had never once let them do before. When it was done, Eunice sat on her own porch in the warm May evening, with a roof that did not leak over her head. And she looked at Samuel's photograph through the window. And she said, "Soft. We got the clinic back. Baby. And the book is where folks can read it now. You were right about the part that matters. They count on you forgetting." She smiled. We did not forget. But there is one more moment in this story, and it is the one that got me the next winter, in January. Another storm rolled down out of the mountains over Hollow Creek. Not as bad as the one before, but cold and dark, with the snow coming down hard and steady. The kind of night that empties the roads and locks the doors. And Eunice Caldwell, 72 years old now, was at the clinic. She did not work there. She was retired 3 times over by now. But she had gone down that afternoon to drop off a pot of beans for the nurse on the late shift. And she had looked at the weather coming in. And she had said the thing she always said. Somebody might need a warm place tonight. So she had stayed. She put on a pot of coffee, and she stacked the blankets by the door, and she sat in the warm, lit-up clinic, with its glass case on the wall and Samuel's open book inside it. And she waited, the way she had waited out 100 storms, because that was who she was. At 9:15, there was a knock at the door, almost the exact same hour. Almost the exact same sound. Eunice got up and went to the door and opened it. A young woman stood there in the snow, early 20s, shaking so hard she could barely stand. A toddler bundled against her chest, the child's face red with cold. "My car went off the road," the young woman said, her voice almost gone. "Up on the county road. We walked. I did not know how far. I saw the light on." She was crying, not from fear, but from the pure flood of relief that comes when you are that cold and that scared. And you finally find a door that opens. Eunice Caldwell did not hesitate. Not for 1 second. Same as the year before? Same voice. Same heart. "Well, get in here before you freeze to death," she said. She took the child and wrapped him in a blanket and set him by the heater. She heated the beans and poured the coffee and called for the ambulance that now sat in the clinic bay, 4 blocks away, instead of 50 miles. And then she sat down across from the young woman, and she let her cry, and let her get warm, and let her be a person again. The young woman looked at her through wet eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she said. "You do not even know me." And Eunice Caldwell smiled, soft and steady and sure. "Somebody once told my husband," she said, "that you keep what you have got. Your warmth, your food, your open door. You keep it until somebody needs it, and then you give it. That is the whole of it. That is the only thing I ever learned that was worth anything." She looked at the glass case on the wall, at Samuel's open book. Somebody needed a warm place once, right here in this valley, in a storm just like this one, and there was not one, so we built one, and now there is. She reached across and squeezed the young woman's cold hand. "This is just what we do here now." Outside, the snow kept falling. The wind pushed against the windows of the little brick clinic that a forgotten valley had fought to reopen. But inside, there was warm light, and hot coffee, and two women and a sleeping child at a table, and a dead miner's open book on the wall where anyone could read it. Eunice poured two more cups, and they sat together, and they were warm. Man, I have watched this story back more times than I can count, and it gets me every single time, because everybody wants the version where a rich man shows up on the porch and writes a check and makes the poor old woman's problems disappear. And that is a nice story. But that is not this one. This one is better, because Eunice Caldwell was never waiting on a rescue. She did not need a millionaire to tell her she had worth. She knew what she was worth. The whole time. When the church closed and the clinic closed and the town forgot her name, she kept her husband's book on a nail for 8 years. And when 6 strangers came through her door in a storm, she did not just save their lives. She found the thing she had been missing, which was a reason to finally open the book and read it back. And she did not get her clinic because somebody felt sorry for her. She got it because she stood up in that courthouse. And she let the most powerful man in the county dismiss her with all his cold and quiet politeness in front of the whole world. And then she took his entire system apart with the only weapons a poor person ever truly has: his own rules used back against him, and the truth written down, read back in front of God and everybody. So, here is what I want to leave you with. Because this is not really a story about one valley, or one nurse, or one storm. How many Eunices does your county already have? How many people are carrying a whole community on their backs right now? For free. Invisible. While the folks in charge count on everybody forgetting. And here is the real one. The one I cannot shake. How many clinics got closed in some near-empty room near you? Traded away for a promise that turned out to be a lie. And nobody followed the money. Because nobody was watching. And nobody wrote it down. Their whole power is that you forget, so do not. If this story moved you, do one thing for me. Drop a comment and tell me about the Eunice in your life. The person who carried more than their share and never asked for a thing. Tag somebody who needs to hear this tonight. And hit subscribe. Because we tell the stories the world tries to forget. And the only way they stay told is if we keep telling them. Do not forget. That is the whole of it. Do not forget